Welcome from Columbia Business School Executive Education. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Mark Roberts, and I'm really pleased to be here with Jeff Heal for today's webinar, Prepare Yourself, Climate Change's Impact on Business. Before introducing Jeff, I'm just going to run through a few simple logistics. As you'll see, we are recording the webinar, and we'll send you a copy of this recording by email in the coming days. For our latest news and updates, you can follow us on LinkedIn at Columbia Business School Executive Education. And finally, and really most importantly, please do submit questions throughout the session using the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those additional questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Heal. Jeff is a professor of economics here at Columbia Business School and has made significant contributions to economic theory and environmental economics. He currently explores developments in energy markets, the impact of climate change on business, and the economics of corporate social responsibility. This June, he's going to be directing and teaching in a brand new executive education program called Business and Climate, The Journey to Net Zero. Jeff also serves as chair of the board of the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, and is a member of the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists, amongst others. He's also the author of 18 books and no less than around 250 articles. And his latest book, Endangered Economies: How the Neglect of Nature Threatens Our Prosperity, sets out the economic and business case for environmental conservation. He's also been a principal in 2 startup companies. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much. It's great to be with you and to be with everybody else in the audience here. Looking forward to this discussion.
Great. Yeah, thanks for joining us. And what we decided to do for this session, as we had so many questions coming in advance of the webinar, we thought we'd use a selection of these questions to really guide the conversation with you, if that's okay. And really the focus is on the impact that climate has and will have on the future of business. So if I can, I'm going to kick straight off with a pretty broad question, but one that came up a lot. So from your perspective, Jeff, what are the top climate issues and trends that leaders should really be keeping on their radar today?
Yeah, that's a good starting question, obviously. I'd say you really divide the answer into 2 pieces here. One is you want to monitor very carefully all of the legislation that's going on around the world relating to climate. Some of that legislation can, for example, provide interesting business opportunities. I mean, here in the US, we've just had the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. That's actually really a climate policy act more than an Inflation Reduction Act. And what that act does is provide a lot of incentives for people to engage in, companies in particular, to engage in climate-friendly activities, and also gives consumers some subsidies for engaging in climate-friendly activities. So that provides a lot of interesting new business opportunities. And I think businesses need to be monitoring those very carefully. And the same thing is happening in the European Union, for example. There's a lot of legislation on climate-related issues there. And I think that any business really needs to be monitoring all of that legislation very carefully to make certain that it's not missing out on any opportunities. Now, this doesn't only happen at the state level, at the federal level. It happens here in the US at the state level as well. In fact, actually, there's probably more sort of climate-related legislation at the state level than there is at the federal level, because it's been so controversial at the federal level. And so lots of states are providing subsidies to renewable energy, subsidies to climate-friendly activities, and interesting opportunities for climate-friendly business activities. And even at the municipal level, there's actually some legislation. For example, New York City is providing some legislation that provides incentives for renewable energy use and so on. So monitor. So my first recommendation is monitor, federal, state, municipal legislation, both here and in the markets, other markets that you're dealing in, very carefully indeed. Then, of course, there's the direct impact of climate change on a business. So, for example, if you're in the agriculture or food business, we know that climate change is causing droughts, it's causing floods, it's causing heat waves. It's making agricultural output much less predictable than it has been in the past. So anybody sort of dealing with the food sector needs to be well aware of some of the risks that are being posed by climate change. Let's take a rather non-obvious one. Productivity of a lot of coffee plantations is being negatively affected by climate change. That's having a big impact on the coffee industry. It's something you might not have expected. What else is there? So sea level rise. sea level is rising around the coasts. And again, if you have coastal properties, you need to be well aware of whether they're exposed to sea level rise, what this could do to their values. Also to the fact that not just is sea level rising, but these coastal storms are getting more frequent and more intense. And the potential for damage from coastal storms is increasing all the time. And in general, real estate portfolios need to be monitored as well. It may not be obvious that climate will affect real estate, but changing temperature patterns, changing precipitation patterns can mean that you need to sort of reinvest in certain types of real estate, change the heating and cooling systems if they're to retain their value. Then finally, of course, there's the energy transition. You know, we are moving away as a result of climate change from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, towards nuclear energy. And that's driving a lot of changes in many associated industries, utility industry, the industry that's concerned with managing the grid and building the grid. So there's a whole lot of changes there. So if you're dealing with any of these industries at all, you need to be aware of what's happening there. If you're, and many people obviously do deal with them, and just about every business uses energy. And so if there are big changes occurring in the energy industry, you need to be aware of those. There could be changes in the cost of energy as a result of this, changes in the availability of certain types of energy. So that's a very high level overview, but there's an awful lot of factors that are going to change as a result of climate change and climate change policies in the next 10 years.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So you've kind of outlined there sort of 4 or 5 really big sort of issues that should be being considered. But one of the questions that came in sort of follows on neatly from that, in that John says, you know, despite issues that are there continues to be reluctance by senior management to really accept the call to action. And how can we address this? So could you share what thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I'm aware of that. Interesting. I mean, positively, unfortunately, most companies are beginning to realize that they can be affected by climate change, and this is something they need to take into account. But for those where there's still reluctance, I think the important point is to emphasize that huge sectors of the economy are already being seriously affected by climate change. And the obvious one is the energy sector. We're transforming the oil and gas industry. We're transforming the utility industry completely. The whole sort of renewable energy industry has grown up from scratch in the last 10 years to be quite a big and important industry. The energy storage industry, making batteries and so on, is going to become a very important industry. And forecasts are that we'll be spending literally trillions of dollars on energy storage over the next couple of decades. So we're seeing huge transformations of these industries there. And the automobile industry, of course, which is an integral part of the US economy and has been for 100 and something years now, has been transformed as we speak, moving away from gasoline-powered cars to electric vehicles. Totally different technologies, different manufacturing processes, and so on. So I think my sort of general advice to senior managers is if all of these industries, which make a large part of the US economy, are being transformed by climate change, and the chances are that you will be transformed by climate change too. I'm sure you're dealing with these industries in some way or another. You're going to be affected by the transformation that's happening there. In addition to that, another point I'd sort of emphasize here is that, particularly if you're selling to consumers, you're in the B2C sector, consumers are increasingly concerned about what businesses are doing about climate change. And they want you to tell them what they're doing about climate change. They want to feel that they're dealing with responsible companies. So I think it's important for companies to have a strategy on climate change, and in particular for the consumer-facing companies to be able to articulate that strategy and use it as part of their PR.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jeff. And if we can zoom out a bit, one of the questions that came in from Sagar was more at the country level than the company level. So he says, what thoughts do you have about countries like India and how they are responding to the climate change, and who is going to implement changes that they need?
So that's a good question. That's also a hard question. There's been quite a big change on the part of developing countries like India. If you go back 20 or so years, they were saying, well, climate change is the industrial country's problem. You've caused the problem, you solve it. But now they're beginning to see that that's actually, we can't rely on industrial countries to solve the problem, that everybody has to work together to solve the problem. And it's also true that nowadays, the biggest emitter of CO2 in the world is actually China, which is essentially a developing country. I mean, I guess it's a middle-income country, but it's not one of the poorer developing countries, but it is a developing country. And India in particular will be the second or third largest emitter of CO2 within a matter of a decade or so. So this is becoming very much a developing country problem as well as a rich country problem. Now, the problem for developing countries is that tackling climate change does require a lot of investment, a lot of upfront capital, and it requires that we invest in renewable energy, we invest in building out the grid and making the grid more reliable, we invest in hardening coastal infrastructure against storms and sea level rise and so on. And all of this is very capital intensive. Now, countries like the US or Europe can have access to that capital, but a lot of developing countries don't. So I think that developing countries are going to need a lot of capital, and we're going to need to encourage a lot of international capital flows from the rich to the poorer countries in order to facilitate this kind of investment. Now, India specifically is actually doing quite well in this respect. India is obviously one of the richer developing countries. 10 years ago, their sort of development strategy relied very much on coal, but within the last sort of 5 or 6 years, they've actually been moving quite substantially away from that and towards renewable energy. They've invested very heavily in solar energy and in wind, and they're developing their energy system in the right direction there. A problem for a country like India, and for most developing countries, is going to be in the transition to electric vehicles. You know, to have a good electric vehicle network, you obviously need lots of chargers all over the country. And with a rather sort of limited grid and a very unreliable grid, it's actually hard to build out those chargers. And it's going to be difficult to persuade people to convert to electric vehicles if they're not absolutely confident that they'll be able to charge them where and when they want. I mean, if the grid is out for 5 or 6 hours a day, which it is in some parts of India, you know, frankly, I would be very reluctant myself to buy an electric vehicle under those circumstances. So they're going to have to invest heavily in the grid for a number of reasons, one of which is the ability to roll out EVs on a national level.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. And moving now to the industry level, we've had quite a few questions around, obviously, the oil and gas industry. And Jennifer and Omar have asked, how do you feel climate change policies will affect the oil and gas industry? And in your opinion, can we ever replace 100% of oil in the future?
Okay, let me take the second bit first. Can we ever replace 100% oil? So oil is used mainly in transportation, ground transportation, maritime transportation, and air transportation. We can replace oil in ground transportation, and we're doing that right now with electric vehicles. We're replacing oil with batteries in light vehicles. And of course, Tesla is famously bringing out its semi-truck, which will be a heavy vehicle. And they claim that they'll have batteries powerful enough to power heavy vehicles as well. Some other companies are bringing out electric trucks, but they're using fuel cells rather than batteries. So I think we'll see oil replaced pretty much completely in ground transportation over the next couple of decades. Air transportation is obviously much more challenging. There is some research right now on battery-powered planes, but nobody expects these to have a range of more than 400 or 500 miles. So you might have, battery-powered planes taking you from, London to Paris or from New York to Washington or something like that. But I don't think you'll be flying across the Atlantic on a battery-powered plane anytime soon, I'm afraid. So the long-range flights are beginning to investigate using something called sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. That's a sort of a biofuel. It doesn't have zero emissions, but it has fewer emissions than conventional jet fuel. So that's an improvement. At the moment, it's a lot more expensive than conventional aviation fuel. So we're not going to see conventional aviation fuel replaced by that rapidly. But if the cost comes down, we could see replacement of some conventional aviation fuel by this. It's not clear that we can produce biofuels on a large enough scale to replace all of the aviation fuel that's used at the moment, because they require growing plants on the land, and they compete with land, with food for land. So there's a bit of an issue there. There is a possibility that we could burn hydrogen. We can. Hydrogen is fairly easy to make. If you pass an electric current through water, you split the H2O into H and O, and the hydrogen then can be burnt. You can fuel a plane on hydrogen. But that technology is quite different from existing technologies. And it's probably 20 years off before we have ready availability of hydrogen-powered planes, maybe even further than that. So anyway, bottom line is we can replace oil in ground transportation. We may be able to replace some of it in air transportation. Same thing again for maritime transportation. There's some possibility for replacing oil there, although although that's quite some way off again. The other major use of oil actually is in making the petrochemical industry and making plastics.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any real anticipation that we're going to replace oil by anything else as a feedstock for making plastics. So oil will continue, I suspect, to be used to make plastics for a long time to come. That actually doesn't matter too much because the use of oil in making plastics doesn't emit any greenhouse gases, or at least emits small amounts of greenhouse gases. So that's not too much of a problem. There is some concern with the use of plastics at an environmental level, and there's an attempt to move away from plastics to sort of biodegradable substances, just plant-based rather than oil-based. That hasn't really taken off yet, but that could take off in the next, next quarter of a century, in which case we'd see a drop in the use of oil there as well.
Great, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to keep the questions moving, if that's okay.
Sure.
There's so many coming in from a diverse view of perspectives, really. So Henry has asked, what's your view on carbon credit markets? And could you talk to that for a few minutes?
Yeah, I could talk to that for hours and hours, actually.
I'm sure you could.
But I won't. Well, there's two types of carbon credit markets, right? There's what we call compliance markets and voluntary markets. And they're really quite different. So it's very important to be clear about that. So the compliance market is a market where you trade carbon credits because you're legally required to comply with some kind of legislation. So, for example, here in New York City, where there's a greenhouse gas, a regulation system, which is a cap and trade system. So if you're a large emitter of greenhouse gases in the northeastern US, you're regulated by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and trade system. And you have to buy carbon credits if you're going to emit carbon dioxide. And there's a market in those, they're resellable and so on. That's a very well-regulated market. It's a very transparent market. There are really no problems in trading in that market. The same thing is true on the West Coast. So California and other West Coast states have a cap and trade system on carbon dioxide emissions. And you can buy and sell credits in that market. You can, for example, you can generate credits that you can sell into that market by developing forests and so on. And again, that's a well-regulated, transparent market. And the same thing is true of the European Union, where there's the European Union has a thing called the European Union's Emission Trading Scheme, or ETS. Again, that's a cap and trade system, and any large emitter of CO2 in the European Union has to take part in that market, has to buy permits if they're emitting CO2. And that's a well-regulated market. It's a good market. Then separately, there's a thing called the voluntary market, the voluntary carbon market. And that's a market where firms can voluntarily purchase carbon credits if they want to be able to say that they're offsetting their CO2 emissions. So a number of companies have voluntarily stated that they will go carbon neutral by 2050. For example, Microsoft has made that statement. Alphabet, the Google parent, has made that statement. And one of the ways that Microsoft is trying to go carbon neutral by 2050 is by buying carbon credits and carbon offsets in the voluntary market. Prices for these carbon offsets in the voluntary market are quite low, usually just a few dollars a ton, whereas the prices in the regulated markets are much, much higher. I mean, the price in the European Union is in the order of $70, $80 a ton. So a radical difference between the prices in these markets. And you have to say, to some extent, you get what you pay for. The voluntary carbon markets are unregulated, and they're a real nightmare, quite frankly. And a lot of carbon credits sold in these are probably worth nothing. Well, they sell for very little, but that's more than they're worth. A lot of them are claimed to be certified, and there are some certification systems that operate in that sector, but the certification systems are very, very weak and really do not guarantee at all that these so-called carbon credits really represent a reduction in CO2 emissions anywhere. So my advice to companies that are thinking of trading in that market is be very, very careful and get some very good advice from experts in the field before you invest a lot of money in carbon credits. I know that the accounting firms are actually getting quite concerned about this. Firms, companies are buying carbon credits, and they're investing in them, they're wanting to show these as assets on their balance sheet. And accountants are looking at these things increasingly and saying, well, what are these actually worth? Are they really worth anything at all? So I think that a lot of people who invested heavily in the voluntary carbon market are going to be in for a nasty shock in the next few years. So again, my advice there is be very, very careful. A lot of the things which are supposedly certified and very high value are probably not. And I would leave buying voluntary carbon credits until that market is better regulated.
And do you see that changing anytime soon, Jeff? Is there signs of regulation on the horizon or not so much?
Well, there's a lot of discussion. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of big financial institutions are concerned about this. As I said, the accounting profession is getting interested in this. They're seeing they're seeing their clients spending more and more money on carbon offsets, and they're wondering whether this is, good use of their clients' funds. So yeah, I think there is some. There's no trend for national government regulation, but there is some trend for voluntary regulation in this area. Now, voluntary regulation can be useful, it can be bad. So it depends a lot. Mark Carney, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, has been trying to set up a set of voluntary regs for this market. Not gone very far yet. But I think maybe within 5 to 10 years, we'll see much better regulation in this market, maybe with some international agency. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been making statements about what this market should be. And if you look at the proceedings of the Paris Agreement back in 2015, or the proceedings of that recent meeting in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the one that occurred at the end of last year, they both actually set out some principles for the management of voluntary carbon markets. And I think that if those get enacted, the markets will be much more reliable places.
Okay. And staying in the finance space, Alexandra has asked, how would you recommend formulating a climate strategy for asset and fund managers?
That's quite a tough question, actually. I think that what's probably motivating this question is that an increasing number of clients of the fund managers are asking for low carbon portfolios. And I'm on the boards of a couple of organizations that have endowments, and they are increasingly asking their fund managers to make certain their portfolios are, quote, low carbon, unquote. So I think the job that fund managers have at this point is trying to decide, what do we mean by a low carbon portfolio, and how can you measure the carbon content of a portfolio? And this unfortunately isn't easy. We're not very good at recording carbon data. We really badly need a carbon accounting system. And again, the accounting profession is beginning to get interested in carbon accounting, measuring carbon, keeping records of carbon emissions and so on. The SEC, as you're probably aware, recently suggested that companies might need to disclose their carbon emissions as part of their disclosures to the SEC, and similar discussions in other countries. So that happens, then companies will need to actually introduce carbon accounts and have more formal records of their use of carbon, their emission of carbon than they do at the moment. But in the meantime, it's actually quite hard to find good, reliable data on companies' carbon emissions. And that's what fund managers obviously need. The carbon emissions of a company are usually divided into 3 categories, what we call Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are your sort of direct emissions from the operation of the company. And Scope 2 emissions are emissions from the electricity that you purchase through the grid. And Scope 3 emissions are emissions from the manufacture of the inputs that you buy or for the use of the products that you sell. I think the most important of those are Scope 1 emissions. And those are actually, fortunately, the ones on which best data is available. So a fund manager can go to a variety of sources to get some data on Scope 1 emissions. The EPA has data on Scope 1 emissions. There's a thing called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is an NGO which engages with companies and tries to persuade them to disclose their carbon emissions. And that has quite good data on the emissions of 10, 20,000 companies around the world. So there's a variety of sources like that. But at the moment, this isn't devising a low carbon portfolio isn't anything like devising a low risk portfolio. We don't have the metrics that we need for that.
Okay, thank you. You've explained hugely on that. And Tony is bringing us a bit more to kind of the people side of things within companies, and is asking, how can internal teams who are removed from planning get involved or add impact to climate change initiatives and progress?
That's interesting. I think a lot of internal functions actually can contribute here. I mean, I just mentioned accounting, for example. You might not think of accounting as being obviously related to the climate change, but actually companies are going to need to account for their use of carbon and their emission of carbon much more carefully than they have in the past. And the accounting profession is getting interested in that. And 5 years from now, you'll find that the accounting functions in companies are probably keeping a careful record of their use of carbon. So accountants will be part of the solution to the problem in the foreseeable future. Take something like human relations, for example. Again, you might not think that human relations has any obvious connection with climate, but human relations, for example, could run courses for company management on climate-related issues, so as to educate them about how their industry relates to climate change, what their industry can be doing about climate change, and what's going on in the company about climate change. Most companies these days have an IT function, which again is not obviously related to climate change, but actually you'll find that probably the company's IT operations are often one of its biggest sources of electricity consumption, and therefore one of its biggest sources of carbon emissions. So again, the people in IT can take some trouble to make certain they're buying efficient equipment and that they're getting their power from climate-friendly sources, which is increasingly possible to do these days. So I don't think there's a general answer there, but I think if you think carefully, many sectors which look to be totally internal and don't seem to have an obvious climate orientation can actually contribute to improving a company's climate position.
Yeah. Okay. So something you mentioned earlier, this is one of the live questions coming in. You talked a little bit about hydrogen a couple of questions back. And Rogerio says, how do you see the hydrogen renewable business maturing in the near future?
The near future, I don't see it being mature in the near future, but I do see it being mature. Well, I don't quite know what you mean by the near future there, but I think the near future is the next 4 or 5 years. And I don't see hydrogen growing hugely in that period, but I do see hydrogen growing really quite important on a sort of a 10 to 15 year basis. I think we can see a situation where we use renewable energy to electrolyze water, split water up into its two components, and then get the hydrogen out of water. And hydrogen can be used as a fuel. You can burn hydrogen in internal combustion engines. Actually, you can burn it in jet engines. Hydrogen is a good way of storing energy. Now, one of the things we're going to need to do on quite a big scale as we move towards more renewable energy is to store energy, because obviously solar and wind power are very intermittent. And so we need a lot of storage capacity. And generating hydrogen, just storing that and then using that to release energy later on is a good way of storing energy. We may use hydrogen itself. There's a real possibility that we could make that hydrogen into ammonia, which is a compound between nitrogen and hydrogen. And ammonia also burns. You can burn in ammonia in engines and so on. And it's much easier to store, and it's much easier to transport in particular. Hydrogen has to be liquefied to transport it. And that involves cooling it down to something like minus 250 degrees centigrade, some totally ridiculous temperature like that. Whereas ammonia can be transported fairly easily as a liquid at more or less room temperature. So I'd actually see an industry evolving where we generate hydrogen using renewable energy, and then we turn that hydrogen into ammonia. We transport that ammonia around as a way of moving essentially renewable energy around.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Our 30 minutes is going fast, so I've got one last question, if I may. So I think this is a good one to end with, and it's coming from Matthew, who's asked, what is the role of a board of directors in promoting and setting the agenda for climate change, including thinking about how they develop and communicate the strategy and purpose?
Yeah, nice high-level question. Well, the role of the board of directors here is, as in many things, is sort of setting the tone of the organization. I think the responsibility of the board of directors is not obviously to get hands-on involved in climate policy, but I think what the responsibility is to make certain that there is a senior executive in the company, somebody in the C-suite, for example, who has clear overall responsibility for climate issues in the company. And that person is sufficiently senior to carry clout, and people will pay attention to him or her. And that person is also adequately resourced, so that whatever action they want to take on climate change, they have the resources to do that. I think the board of directors should make certain that someone like that is in charge of climate issues. There's a single point there. And they should meet with that person on a regular basis, discuss how this is going. Maybe set up a subcommittee to meet with a climate subcommittee to meet with that person on a regular basis. And they should also probably charge that person with making a report to the board of directors on an annual basis, or maybe even a semi-annual basis, to report how climate change issues are going. But I think you do need a single point of responsibility really high up in the company, and a well-resourced point of responsibility. And I think that that's something that the board of directors needs to be involved in, and make certain that's going well.
Okay, that sounds like solid advice. Thank you, Jeff. Our time is sadly up. Thank you so much for the discussion and for bringing your expertise to bear on those questions, which bounced around many sort of different topics. We're really looking forward to your new executive program, Business and Climate, the Journey to Net Zero. And I know that's taking place at Columbia Business School, both in person and live online in June the 13th to the 16th. We'll make sure we send everyone an email with some more information on that program for sure. But to everyone on behalf of Columbia Business School Executive Education, I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to join us today and for joining in the session. We hope you've enjoyed it and have a really good day. Thank you.